Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. I'm Randy Wright, and I'll be your captain on this solo flight special edition of our state-of-the-art radio program. Folks, this will be the final boarding call, so if you please, claim your seats, fasten your seatbelts, kick back, relax, and enjoy the show while I go ahead and delve into the pre-flight checklist, as there really is a lot of news and information to get to before I may fully indulge you with your in-flight entertainment. Well, folks, we see that Mark Levin has put out a piece over there at the Conservative Review in which he's trying to differentiate or distinguish between nationalism, populism, and progressivism. And it was a very detailed argument and article that I read through. And while he does get a lot of the history correct, there's still one critical and crucial aspect of it that I found that he was sorely missing in, and something that needed to be included with it. And that was that the entire purpose of what he calls Americanism, which he explained as following the Constitution and the guiding foundational principles of this once thriving and flourishing representative republic and vibrant community of popular sovereigns of ours, is this. He didn't mention the natural law aspect of it. Now, that may seem like I'm splitting hairs or that I am focusing on the minutia instead of looking at the overarching picture that is more important to the grand scheme of things in this once thriving and flourishing representative republic and vibrant community of popular sovereigns of ours. But it's not that I'm really doing that. The reason that you have to be so focused on it, so driven in, so zoomed in, for lack of a better term, on something of that magnitude is because we know that these nefarious elements that are attempting to fundamentally and irreparably redefine the United States of America as some sort of frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftist dystopia, as opposed to a constitutionally endowed federalist representative republic, is that they will try and play in the minutia. They will try and reinterpret the Constitution. But one of the things that my first officer, Jeremy Grapenton, and indeed our first Air Marshal, Mr. Nelson Ward, as well as yours truly, has pointed out on very many of our previous episodes with respect to the Constitution is when you look at the Ninth Amendment to the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments to our shared United States Constitution, you will discover that it says that you cannot interpret the Constitution in such a way as to infringe upon or encroach upon other rights that are listed within it. And what a lot of people try and say that means is, oh, well, it's just speaking to the application of the Bill of Rights to the states, which just isn't true. First of all, the states subjected themselves to the Bill of Rights and any of the amendments when they ratified them. And so that meant that they availed themselves of the application of the Bill of Rights. And that's something that even in constitutional law courses that they get wrong. But Levin was trying to focus primarily on this push for nationalism and the new age populist movements that have emerged in the United States, and was trying to say rather that it was something that's been tried before. It's something that's been mulled over before, and he is right. The populist age was in the late 1880s through the 1890s until it was completely consumed by the more aggressive progressive movement that was established by then Republican president in 1900 or so, 1902 or so, Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Theodore Roosevelt is the father of modern progressivism. He wanted a strong, robust central or federal government that ultimately would control everything, that the private sector should be subservient to government interests, and that the office of President of the United States of America should literally be the strongest attribute and the strongest aspect of American culture and society. But when we look at the foundational principles, particularly with respect to the natural law, we see that the United States of America was founded to be a limited government. And that makes sense when you also stop and look at the beautiful, near poetic language that is found in the preamble to our shared United States Constitution when it says that we, the people, in order to create a more perfect union, to secure the blessings of liberty, and to also promote the domestic tranquility, ordain and establish. And so, what that tells us is that this government was started by we the people. The government belongs to us, the Constitution belongs to us, this entire Federalist Republic belongs to us. And in other words, for the Republic to work and to have any type of legitimate authority at the central or federal level, it must trace itself back to powers that were specifically enumerated to the government by the clear and concise language contained in the four corners of our shared United States Constitution. Now, I know that I have mentioned that repeatedly in previous episodes of Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, almost to the point of it becoming ad nauseum, and it may not always be clear what I mean by that. Well, literally, what that translates into is that we, the people, in our capacity as the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty, delegated certain amounts of authority to the government. The terms and conditions of those powers that we delegated are controlled by the Constitution, which includes the Bill of Rights or the first 10 amendments. And so the natural law tenets control that. The entire structure of our Constitution is that of a social compact or contract. And in fact, it is the greatest social contract ever devised by the hands of men, yet divinely inspired by providence above. And what that means is that whenever the government, which is a party to that contract, acts in a way that is rogue, tyrannical, and ultimately illegitimate, when you look at the First Amendment, and see that the people have the right to petition their government for a redress of grievances, it speaks to that. In other words, that is an avenue by which we, the people, the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty in these United States of America, can go forth and say, look, this government is not operating in a manner that is in our best interest. This government is not sticking to the terms and conditions that are listed out in the contract that we are all a party to. That is part of the natural law tenets. That is part of the reason why we say that the aspects of our Constitution are immutable, meaning they are just as applicable today as they were at the inception of this nation some 235 years ago, as God willing they will be some 235 years from today. But we see that there are these nefarious elements within society itself. And that is one of the things that Levin touched upon in his article over there at Conservative Review. But it goes beyond them just trying to tear down the Constitution. They are trying to rewrite the American identity within a whole. And he spoke about one of the early muckraking speeches that Theodore Roosevelt had given towards the turn of the 20th century, around 1901, I believe it was. And he was saying that this was rejecting the limitations on the federal government. And he was right. That's what Theodore Roosevelt was doing. Roosevelt wanted a very aggressive, very robust, centralized government, particularly with respect to the executive branch. And what that tells us is there was this sort of strain of mindset, strain of thought, for lack of a better term, in which the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialists, because that's literally what progressives are, wanted to basically make an emperor within the country. Or if not an emperor, at least an oligarchy, where it is their specific class of elites running the country. And of course, that kind of mindset had gotten started at least in the opening days of our republic under Alexander Hamilton. It was Hamilton that pushed that kind of notion, that kind of mindset. And what Hamilton really wanted to achieve, folks, was to have this ability to have a very select subset of people control the way that government worked and to control the economy from a nationally owned bank. Now, folks, we see that all the time in socialist nations, the Bank of England, the Deutsche Bank, all of these other nations that have a centralized bank. And so one of the movements that rose in response to that was Andrew Jackson's populism. And I'm sure that a lot of you, our cherished listening passengers and audience members, have heard before these connections of Andrew Jackson, or comparisons rather, of President-elect Trump to Andrew Jackson. And when people talk about Jacksonian democracy, what they're talking about is a system that was deliberately designed to, once again, amass power in the hands of the central or federal government. And when you have the centralized or federal government controlling all auspices of government and all auspices of the way that power is to be projected, utilized, and exercised, then you've got a major problem. You've got a problem that is diametrically opposed, and a system also that is diametrically opposed to the way that our constitutionally endowed Federalist Representative Republic was designed to work. And that's the thing. We see that the first panics that started in this nation, the first economic turmoil that hit the nation, occurred after Andrew Jackson, when Van Buren, his hand-picked man, became president. Well, if we're going to make those comparisons to Trump, there's a couple of differences that we need to point out, and it's something that Levin did touch upon in that article. First and foremost, the first time that Andrew Jackson attempted to clinch the reins of political power in the United States, he won the popular vote but lost the Electoral College. That's the exact flip opposite of what happened in this disastrous fiasco known as the 2016 presidential election cycle. So already there are some stark differences, but there are the similarities that cannot be ignored, and those similarities are not the good attributes of Jackson, such as Jackson went in with this idea that he would dissolve the Bank of America, the national bank, not to be confused with that oversized government bailed out bank that we have today, but and to pay off the national debt. Whereas Trump has proposed $1 trillion in a span of 10 years of infrastructure spending. That's more akin to FDR than Andrew Jackson. But the fact of the matter is, all of these things will lead to a truly horrific economic collapse, the likes of which we have not seen since October of 1929, and that got worse under the New Deal that was pushed by FDR, which was on top of a miniature New Deal that came by his predecessor, the so-called businessman outsider and proclaimed conservative Herbert Hoover. We know that in the 20s, the Republican Party was split, much as it is split today in 2016, and as it will be in 2017. You had the constitutionalists, or as we call them here at Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, the constitutional compositionists under Calvin Coolidge, and then you had the progressive wing that was still trying to maintain some grips on the party, even though they had almost completely at that point flocked over to the Democrats. That was the workings of Woodrow Wilson, who was also a frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist, leftist, and progressive. And so we see that Hoover was kind of the last vestige of that. But he knew that the only way that he could win was to proclaim that he was a conservative, to proclaim that he would have continued some of the sound policy positions of Calvin Coolidge, the last true dyed-in-the-wool constitutional compositionist that served as president of the United States. And therefore, the tiered system that he put forth with price regulations and price controls, all in an attempt to stop the hemorrhaging of the Wall Street crash of 1929, it failed. And in fact, when FDR managed to get into the White House and managed to push forth the New Deal and really pushed even more progressive agendas than his cousin Theodore had, it plunged the nation into an even greater depth of despair. And the Depression worsened and lasted for a full-on decade. Now, Mark Levin got all of this history right. But the one thing he didn't focus on was how it wasn't just pushing notions such as the income tax amendment, which is the 16th Amendment, or the populist direct vote of senators, which is the 17th Amendment. It's also that they were pushing to end the boundaries of federalism, that it was entirely to eradicate the notion of the natural law tenets that encompass everything with respect to the Constitution, because that is the very bedrock foundation upon which the entire edifice of our constitutionally endowed federalist representative republic is built. So when you start to undermine the foundation of, say, a building or of a structure, then the entire structure is weakened. And the threat of collapse becomes a much greater possibility or a much more likely scenario or outcome. And that is part of the danger that we're facing right now. It's because these old moldover ideas, as Levin had said, they're not new. They've been tried before and they failed before, are worsening in how they're doing it. They are pushing incrementally towards this. And that's the other thing that Levin sort of missed, I thought, at least in that article, because he didn't talk about how each and every time that we started to divert from the Constitution or to change direction from the Constitution, that we never really walked it back, that we never really weakened the power of the federal government again to its proper mandated scope and application as outlined in the Constitution. And what that tells us is that each and every time that we deviate, the deviation stays, so that it's not like changing a lane in the road. It's as though the entire road is being restructured, is being manipulated to fit a certain direction or to travel a certain direction, forcing the entire nation into that direction, which is not necessarily in the best interest of the nation or of the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty, we the people. And of course, that is a danger we must be cognizant of. It is one that we must be wary of. And part of the danger that I see with President-elect Trump is that he has repeatedly said that to make America great again, we have to not get rid of entitlements, not change any of these things that are out of control or are distanced from the Constitution and thereby contrary to the Constitution. And then when you look at Article 6, Clause 2, what's known in the common vernacular as the Supremacy Clause, it's violating the supreme law of the land. That doesn't matter. That's not what his focus is. He wants the government to do it. He thinks the government is the end-all, be-all solution. And we certainly caught glimpses of that throughout the 2016 campaign season. Remember that one of the things that his daughter Ivanka Trump had pushed for was mandatory federal parental leave. Not just maternal, but parental, meaning both parents. And an increased federally mandated minimum wage of $15 an hour. Now, again, what is it that makes America great? Is it our government that makes us great, or is it the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty, we the people, that makes it great? That is the point of contention that the rank and file of the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media are not discussing. That is certainly what the so-called alternative right or alt-right is not discussing, because they are diametrically opposed to that. They don't want you to think that, hey, wait a minute, maybe it's this idea of the individual creative spirit, individual ingenuity that made this nation propel to such lofty heights in her relatively brief yet illustrious history. Yet that is exactly what did make this nation great. And that's why Jeremy and I always took substantial issue with that platitude that was the campaign slogan of the Trump campaign throughout the primary process. And not just primary process, throughout the election. Make America great again. No, America never has ceased being great, because America is great because of its people, not because of the government. You see, there is the fundamental flaw in the approach of populists, progressives, Fabians. They all turn to government. They don't define it based on the people, but the government would not exist but for the powers that were delegated unto it by the American people. And so if we do not get that fundamental basic strain correctly, if we don't get that correct, then the entire thing is moot. And it's not that America ceased being great, it's that the government sought to supplant greatness with itself, and that is the recipe for disaster. That is what will fail each and every time, and we must be cognizant and aware of that fact. Because unless and until we are willing to admit that, and unless and until we are willing to discuss this in an open, honest, but above all objective fashion, these problems are going to continue. They're not only going to continue unabated, they are going to accelerate exponentially. So again, it comes from a frame of mind. Now, while Mark Levin is almost there, I think this aspect of just barely touching on that and not even really mentioning the natural law attributes of the Constitution leads it to where we can basically fall astray or be led astray once again, falling back into these pitfall traps that led to these political fads. Because again, what is it about the Constitution that makes it timeless? It is the very natural law tenets upon which the whole thing's based. That's the reason why all of the political fads that have arisen since the final ratification of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights back in December of 1791 have been passing fads. They are not rooted in the natural law, which by its nature is immutable. meaning just as applicable today as it was when our founding fathers sat down and penned that document, as God willing it will be centuries from today. But part of what the American spirit is, and part of what makes up the notion of constitutional compositionism, is that we, in our capacity as the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty and as one of the parties directly influenced and affected by the Constitution and that contract, must be reticent in its defense. We must be proactive, we must maintain it, and we must secure the blessings of liberty, not just for our generation, but for the up and coming generations, and indeed those generations which have yet to be born. And again, we see that that is codified in the preamble to the Constitution that lays out the duties, obligations, and responsibility of the American people. And then when we go to this notion of nationalism, particularly the way in which the so-called alternative or alt-right is attempting to define it, we find that, again, that goes against the grain of what is contained in the clear and concise language of the Constitution, particularly with respect to the preamble. Because, again, it's all people that are American citizens, not based on skin color, not based on ethnicity or language. It's based on law. What defines America is law, not a subset of people, not a particular people. In fact, that was exactly the sort of system that our founding fathers were fighting against in that long, drawn-out, bloody affair known as the American War of Independence. And again, it takes this kind of objective and rational approach to fully understand that. And of course, that makes sense because when you stop and think about it, the natural law as a philosophy is based on this notion that it is inscribed on the hearts of humanity and can be universally understood through the basic application of logic and reason. Again, that ties directly into who we are, both as a nation and as a people. But it's not being discussed. Certainly, the Stephen K. Bannons of the world are not going to be discussing that because he claims to be an economic nationalist. Well, an economic nationalism is what the USSR was. The Soviet Union was based on that. Economic nationalism is what the National Socialist German Workers' Party was based off of. Any flavor, form, or facet of socialism, as Alexis de Tocqueville so adequately pointed out, is just a form of New Age feudalism in that it seeks to micromanage the daily, the facets of our daily lives. And that's what Bannon wants to do. That's what Trump is starting to set up. That's part of the reason why he has been consistently inconsistent. It's because he knows, as the Pied Piper of disillusioned conservatives, if he started to go off the tune of saying what they wanted to hear, they wouldn't buy into it. And the one thing Trump is a master at is marketing, image, self-promotion. So that's what we face right now, as I sit here speaking into this microphone, conveying this message unto you. And so the question is, how do we overcome it? What do we do? It's simple. It's what we here at Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, have been telling you to do and saying what we needed to do nationally since our premiere episode aired back on September 11th of 2015. And that is get back to basics. Now, doesn't that sound overly simple even? Well, what we mean is that what will restore this nation to the path of prosperity is by getting back to the Constitution and thereby the natural law tenets that underpin this entire society and government of ours. And it's why we say that the United States is greater than the sum of its parts. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts because, again, that is tied directly into what our founding fathers expected us to do. And the only way we can do that is to be stalwart in our defense of the Constitution. It literally is the only thing we can do. The other thing that I think that Mark Levin was missing in that article that he had put out at Conservative Review is this whole notion of the rise of the so-called alternative or alt-right. Now, yes, the left has tried to pigeonhole that movement into kind of a stereotypical application, just being a certain type of people and not even looking at the greater overarching aspects of what the alternative or alt-right encompasses and entails. And what that really is kind of a dangerous short-sightedness, in my opinion, because when you look at how the alternative right is attempting to redefine conservatism, it's pushing it to the left. And of course, the rank and file of the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media is not going to want to cover it in that fashion, is not going to wish to discuss it in that fashion, because that in and of itself sort of works against their mindset and against their Fabian socialist leftist propagandistic agenda. And that's one of the things that we have covered repeatedly here at Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer. And it's important that we keep that in mind because it tells us that it's not just the left and right political paradigm that we're talking about. We're talking about the fundamental pillars that build this nation, that are the weight bearing and the critical aspects of who we are, both as a nation and as a people. And of course, it may seem highly abstract to try and figure out what all of these terms, such as populism, progressivism, Fabianism, nationalism, and even the alt right ideology itself, uh, as opposed to what really matters to people. And it is a failing of the political class in being unable to reach the average ordinary citizen who is caught up in the facets of their daily lives and is just attempting to survive in these harsh and difficult times we're facing right now. And that is something that the great visionary and academician Zygmunt Dobbs warned about, not just in his magnus opus of Keynes at Harvard, but in many of the testimonies and pamphlets that he had written for Congress during that time, saying that there are these nefarious elements that are attempting to engage in games of semantics and are basically moving forth in such a way as to overburden the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty in this once thriving and flourishing representative republic of ours. And he did beautifully display that with Keynesian economics, where they would use all sorts of vague and ambiguous terminology in order to create a code language of what they were hoping to force upon the nation. And that's how they blanket the things that they're trying to force upon us to lull the people into a false sense of security so that we would surrender our essential liberties for a fleeting sense of security. And of course, that brings up one of the most famous quotes of Benjamin Franklin, and one of the ones that we have repeated here time and again, that those who sacrifice essential liberties for a fleeting sense of security deserve neither liberty nor security and shall surely have neither. And I want to tie this in to what sort of phenomenon we see developing with respect to President elect Donald J. Trump. we see that J.D. Rucker at the New Americana has published a piece, and this was about 9 hours ago that he did this. It said, since releasing a video detailing the executive actions Donald Trump intends to initiate in his first 100 days in office, there have been several stories written, and then he goes on to say, not to mention a slew of questions on social media about why some of his most prominent promises weren't included. And of course, he says, no, he's not backtracking on Obamacare, though he hinted about revising instead of repealing and replacing last week, deporting millions of illegal aliens, or building his wall. The video was intended to outline, according to Rucker, executive actions only: Obamacare, budgeting the wall, and adding immigration and customs enforcement, or ICE, funding for increased deportations all require action from Congress in order to work. So, what Rucker is hinting at here, folks, is literally looking at how the structure of our government works, the way that there are those three separate branches of government, and that was by design. And it is one thing that Levin touched upon in his article over there at the Conservative Review, in so much as being fallible, which humanity is. There is no question, no sane or rational person would say that humanity is perfect, or that we can even achieve perfection in this earthly mortal realm in which we live. But what we can see is that due to our imperfect nature, we are very susceptible to having mistakes or twisted machinations and ideologies having a disproportionate impact on the entire community when we illicitly concentrate the authority and the apparatus of government in the hands of one or a few. Now, folks, an oligarchy and an absolutist state and a totalitarian state and even a monarchy is set up in such a way as the ruling elites have all of the power. And socialism is no different. Again, it goes back to de Tocqueville basically calling it a form of soft despotism. And that is what it is, because it proclaims to be looking out for the interest of the people. In other words, it couches itself in these populist messages, which might strike a chord with the people, but does not literally work for their best interest. Again, because when you have this idea of self responsibility and self accountability working in tandem to give you self determination as the entire basis of your governmental system, any deviation from that leads to consequential problems. Now, one of the things that Levin said in that article was that he was looking at Europe and said, well, Europe didn't adopt our type of system because they had their own history to deal with that we didn't have to, that they had kings that we didn't have, but we did in our colonial period. And we certainly cannot ignore the fact that England was the nation in which the natural law tenets began to really take an effect on an earthly realm with the establishment of Magna Carta, and then the provisions of Oxford, and then finally with the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and finally refined to near perfection with the Constitution. And that's the thing. We cannot just pick and choose the parts of our history that we speak to. That is what the historical revisionists have done. That is what these movements that are seeking to blot out any history of the Confederate States of America are doing. And when you disregard or ignore those critical aspects of our nation's history, it blinds us to who we are as a nation and as a people. In fact, in that famous Civil War documentary by Ken Burns, put out on PBS back in the late 80s, Shelby Foote, a Southern author, said that you cannot understand the identity of the United States in the 20th century and on without having an understanding of the conflict that was the war between the states. And again, it's because we were testing the waters of what the Constitution was, how it would apply, and who we are as a people. And so it was a conflict in which certain aspects really did go wrong. This idea of a highly centralized and concentrated power within a central government was really fostered under the Lincoln presidency. Lincoln really did believe in consolidating power. Lincoln was a progressive of his day. And that's, again, something that the historical revisionists ignore. They attempt to proclaim that Lincoln was our greatest president. Why? Because they miss the critical attributes of what it was that the war was about. Yes, slavery was one major component of it, but so was economics, so was the application of government, so was the strength of the federal government. And so those attributes, which are just glossed over in our institutions of education from coast to coast and border to border, are the critical aspects of what that war was about. Why 2% of the population was willing to go out and lay down their lives. And of course, what the left tries to do is to play into the Marxist approach of history, looking at that as though it was purely based on class, when in fact nothing could be further from the truth. It was because a man wanted power in his hands without going through the necessary and proper channels of authority. Lincoln was the first to really go about that, although he really wasn't the first. Andrew Jackson had done that. But Lincoln was taking it to the next level. Lincoln was taking it to how the states were to act and react, whereas Jackson didn't have that much influence. The states would still thumb their noses at him, but he certainly had times during his presidency in which he did that. And in fact, one of the most famous things that Jackson had done, or perhaps I should say infamous things Jackson had done, was when the Supreme Court had ruled on the Cherokee issue with the Trail of Tears. Jackson went forth and said, yeah, so what? Basically, he said that the Supreme Court has made their ruling, now let them enforce it. That's not how our system of polity in these United States of America works. Again, it's why there is a separate branch of legislative, executive, and judicial. The judicial reviews, the executive enforces, the legislative drafts and proposes the laws. And the reason that's not concentrated in the hands of a single entity or single individual is because the fallibility of mankind is that of which would allow the mistakes to be amplified to such a great extent and degree that its ramifications would be felt not just for that current generation, but for all of the generations to come. You know, we are still feeling the impacts of the struggles that we're engaged in during the Jacksonian era and the struggles that we're engaged in during what is known in the common vernacular as the American Civil War. And that is not some small thing. It shows that despite the way that the Constitution really does lay out a grand path, a path of freedom, we still had to argue over that. And in fact, the central question that was at the center of some of the most heated and contentious debates during the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia are still being felt. What is the proper scope and application of federal power? Well, that struggle will always exist in a representative form of government. That's just the nature of the beast, so to say. But going back to the Trump aspect of it, the list of what Trump had said was that he could send a notification of intent to withdraw from TPP and renegotiate, cancel restrictions on production of energy, including shale oil and clean coal, formulate a rule that every new regulation requires two old regulations to be eliminated, call for a comprehensive plan to protect infrastructure from cyber attacks, direct the Department of Labor to investigate visa abuse, and impose a 5-year ban on executive officials becoming lobbyists and a lifetime ban on them lobbying for foreign governments. Well, first of all, you can't do that. Not without Congress and not without actually considering the Constitution. And that is the great danger that we face with Trump. And that really cannot be accepted because, again, part of the problem that we had throughout the disastrous 2 terms of the Barack Hussein Obama regime is that we had, at an exponential rate, further distanced and divorced ourselves from the supreme law of the land, which, pursuant to Article 6, Clause 2, or the Supremacy Clause, is none other than our shared United States Constitution. And when we keep that in mind, we see that any continuation of that, without actually going back to strict adherence to the clear and concise language contained within the Constitution, is only going to worsen the unraveling and the societal blight and decay that we have experienced over the last 8 some odd years. And I don't think we can afford it. I really don't. But let's see. Send a notification of intent to withdraw from TPP and renegotiate. Well, Congress already had done that. And the way that you would send the notification of intent to withdraw from TPP and renegotiate as a president is to veto it if it hits your desk. But recall that one of the fights that has come up in our system of polity several times was this whole notion of a line item veto. That was something that Bill Clinton wanted. Certainly at the state governments, many of the governors or the chief executive of the state level government have line item vetoes, but not at the federal level. Again, because the federal government, by its very design and nature, is supposed to be limited in its breadth of power and the scope and application of the exercising of its power. And so the president is not enumerated the power to be a legislator. Article 1, Section 8 delegates or enumerates authority unto Congress and Congress alone to legislate. So the intent would be found by a veto. And again, that's part of the whole attribute of the problems that I have with Trump. It's that he isn't really staying within the confines of the Constitution. He's not operating by how the law was designed to work. In other words, he is just doubling down on these efforts that further distance and divorce ourselves from the Constitution. And as we have so oft times reiterated on previous episodes of Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, that's part of the great magnitude of the problems and, dare I say, plethora of problems that we are facing as I sit here speaking into this microphone, conveying this message unto you. But let's break it down even further too. Cancel restrictions on production of energy, including shale oil and clean oil. Now, he can do that with executive orders. He can recall executive orders that were passed by the previous regime. But here's the thing. When you look at the supremacy clause of the Constitution, it says that any executive order or any law, in fact, that has been passed, which is contrary to the clear and concise language contained within the four corners of our shared United States Constitution, is void ab initio, meaning that it has no binding legal effect of law from the very outset. Why? Because it is contrary to the very legal basis of the country. And that's part of the discussion that has been swept under the rug. That's part of the things that have been ignored by far too many, and it's not something that should be ignored. So, yes, it would be a token gesture, but all he would have to do is say, in an executive order, I repeal all unconstitutional executive orders. But again, Trump doesn't understand that because by his own admission, he said that he's never once read the Constitution from cover to cover because he's never found any inherent nor any intrinsic value within that document. And that is a major problem. That is something that should be sounding off the alarm bells and sending up red flags for every decent, hardworking, red-blooded American citizen, because it goes to the very heart of the way that polity is supposed to work and the way that authority and power is to be implemented and exercised in this republic of ours. Then he says, formulate a rule that every new regulation requires two old regulations to be eliminated. Again, that is legislative in nature. Congress would have to do that. Then call for a comprehensive plan to protect infrastructure from cyber attacks. You can maybe do that under some of the existing laws, but again, that seems like quite a stretch for an executive order. Direct the Department of Labor to investigate visa abuse. All right, because that is an executive department, I'll give him that one. He can control how it's run. But here, this last one, impose a 5-year ban on executive officials becoming lobbyists and a lifetime ban on them lobbying for foreign governments. Now, all of a sudden, you are saying that you're going to limit the economic due process, which, granted, that is a term that has not been used lately, yet the Supreme Court never fully overturned the Lochner decision from 1904, which said that you cannot infringe upon the rights of individuals to contract for their labor. And in that case, it was the New York bakers who were fighting a minimum wage law that had been proposed by the state of New York back in 1903. And so when you start to say that the fruits of the labor of the individuals cannot be contracted for by their own fruition, that just can't work. The other aspect of that is it would have to be contractual, and Contract Law 101 says that there cannot be an illusory contract. Now, what I mean by that is that means that the contract has to have definite terms and a definite time period. Well, this would not be a definite time period, a lifetime ban. So the other aspect that you have to keep in mind with that, see, the Constitution can last in perpetuity because it is more than a mere contract. It is a compact. But with respect to this ban that is being proposed by Trump there, while it sounds nice, and yeah, we would love to see some curtailment on the special interest lobbyists, there's another critical attribute of it that has to be considered. What that creates is an ex post facto law, which means that it would retroactively apply. And on top of that, it is a bill of attainder in so much as it is specifying a certain target group. Now, Article 1, Section 9 prohibits both. ex post facto laws, and bills of attainder. So already we are running afoul of the Constitution in this list of proposals. And that is a type of populism. He's doing it to say, put America first, which is okay, that sounds good. Except that when you start to realize that when you do that sort of thing, there's going to be repercussions from other parties, other governments, and therefore it's going to hurt commerce. It's going to hurt our ability to be independently sovereign. It is going to weaken our status, not just in the geopolitical sphere, but in the domestic sphere at home as well. And therefore, we have to be cognizant and wary of these lingering and looming dangers. And unfortunately, I am not seeing that that Trump would exercise any type of restraint with that. And again, this is what happens when our government distances and divorces itself from the supreme law of the land. Instead of operating within the confines that were so meticulously set out by our founding fathers, which gave us the longest contiguous or uninterrupted running constitutional document in the entire scope and course of human events, we begin to unravel. It leads to greater problems. It opens the door to the government becoming something that it was never intended to be. And folks, when you look at the current state of affairs ailing and afflicting, and dare I say, plaguing the United States right now, we can ill afford this. We simply cannot afford to allow ourselves to be maneuvered into such a path that would continue the degradation and decay of our entire system of polity. And that is a major danger that we are facing here. And again, these lists put forth by Trump cannot work. Now, Rucker said from a federalist, meaning he is creating a new federalist third party. That has been one of his major initiatives throughout the course of the 2016 election after Trump managed to secure the nomination for the gutless opposition party, or GOP. He says these are all quite acceptable. A few are more fluff than effective, but all are well intentioned. Okay, that's good. But here's the problem. We have to look not at the intentions, not at the even fluff attributes of them. We have to base it on the Constitution. Now, I respect J.D. Rucker very much, but again, the attribute that we have to keep in mind and the functioning of our government that we have to keep in mind is that it must be firmly rooted in the supreme law of the land, or our Constitution. And that's the problem. We are not following through with that. We are allowing ourselves to emotionalize aspects of the law without taking the critical step of logically and rationally analyzing these elements to see whether they fall in line with the Constitution or not. And again, it's like why we said on previous episodes of Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, that when it comes to determining whether or not a respective candidate is qualified to be president, the only litmus test that matters is the Constitution. Well, the same thing applies to executive orders and every law. That is why the Supremacy Clause is so important. Then the other attributes of, let's say, the Commerce Clause, which is found in Article 1, Section 8, that bothers me about it is that, again, that is restricted to the legislature. Congress is the only branch of government that has the enumerated power to regulate commerce, not the president, except in ways that it could be delegated or limited. But again, this overarching scale is going beyond the clear and concise language that is contained within the four corners of our Constitution, and is thereby continuing this well-entrenched pattern of distancing and divorcing ourselves from the law of the land. And every time that we do that, it worsens the status quo in the country. But more so than just that, it takes us down a path we can ill afford to take because we've already so distanced ourselves from the Constitution that I would say it's arguable as to whether our founding fathers would even recognize the nation that they left us. But recall that pursuant to the beautiful language of the preamble to the Constitution, what we're trying to effectuate here is ensuring the domestic tranquility and securing the blessings of liberty for posterity. That means we must be stalwart. It means that the more vigilant we are about this and the more meticulous we are about this, the better off we'll be both as a nation and as a people. I think the best way to put all of this into the proper connotation is to go back to what started our constitutional line of thinking, one of the earliest documents, and perhaps one of the most famous, because when we start to look at what it was that inspired us and the source from which we derived the approach to the Constitution, it helps put into complete context what we are facing with respect to the different notions of nationalism, populism, and progressivism and Fabianism, and also why they are out of line or certainly out of character with respect to what we have put forth as the supreme law of the land in this once thriving and flourishing representative republic and vibrant community of popular sovereigns of ours. And so to do that, we have to look at the Mayflower Compact. And since we are fast approaching the Thanksgiving holiday, I think it's an apt and appropriate time to speak to this. Now, what exactly was the Mayflower Compact? Well, it was the first governing document of the Plymouth colony. It was written by the male passengers of the Mayflower, consisting of separatist Congregationalists who were essentially your Puritans, and the adventurers and tradesmen, most of whom were referred to by separatists as strangers. But both of these groups would become the Pilgrims. And the separatists were the ones that were fleeing from religious persecution by King James. But this compact or contract was signed aboard the ship on the 11th of November in 1620. They used the Julian calendar, which has old style dates, which at the time was 10 days behind the Gregorian calendar. So it was really signed on November 21st. But anyway, the entire compact was originally intended for this colony that had been bound for Virginia. However, while they were financed by the Company of Merchant Adventurers of London, storms had forced them to anchor at the Hook of Cape Cod in what is now Massachusetts. And they were running so low on provisions that it was not a good idea to try and venture further south to get to where they were originally wanting to land. So, what is the Mayflower Compact all about? First of all, it's important to just kind of get an idea of what this document even looked like. And it was a handwritten document that was, as we said, signed by the male members of the ship. And it was to set out basic laws, basic governing principles and law. And you can see here, it's written in that old secretariat hand, Great Britain and France, and you see it's a contract set out as a legal document, as it was always intended to be. And its purpose, its entire purpose, was to establish the law. And so the The text says, and while the original has been lost, there are 17th century versions. It says that in the name of God, Amen, we, whose name are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James, by the grace of God of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, defender of faith, etc. There is your example of what the sort of monarchical sovereignty was like, having undertaken for the glory of God and advances of the Christian faith and honor of our king and country a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God furtherance of the ends and one another covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politique. Look right there, when we say that a constitution, being a social contract, is what defines us as a nation and a people, that part there, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politique. So, right there, that shows that from the earliest days, our nation was based on this notion of the people being the sovereigns for our better ordering in order to promote the domestic tranquility and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, so to accomplish what we had set forth, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws. Okay, there's your supreme law of the lands, ordinances, that's your laws in promoting just the average things that are necessary, acts, which means legal actions, constitutions, meaning further greater laws to expand upon this, and offices from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. So, right there, it is a social contract. It was the beginnings of how our system of polity would develop. And it's why we say that the Constitution basically is that agreement in which it defines we, the people, as the body politique of the United States. In other words, that all of the auspices of government is there to serve us and is possessed and owned by us and is a quintessential part of who we are, both as a nation and as a people. And it it comes down to that strain of ideology, and it speaks to how our independent identity developed. Because you see, when England disregarded the houses of burgesses, the magistrate courts, all of those things that had been set up in the New World, it was going against something that had already become a well-established precedent. The colonists had this due to the great distance and the struggles that communication presented, and the inability for the central parliament in London to be able to address the immediate concerns and needs of the colonists on the ground in the New World. It forced them to develop their own identity and ideology. And so when they went against that, it was highly offensive to the colonists, because by that point, the things that had happened with the Mayflower Compact and whatnot was out of memory. It was out of living memory. So they had only known the systems that they had developed there, and therefore they thought it highly suspect that the king was now retrenching them when the king was fine with it from the point of 1620 until 1775. So you see, it was a building up, a ratcheting up of the tensions, a divergence away from this idea of being mere subjects to a sovereign thousands of miles away. And so This rugged individualism and independence, of which Mark Levin spoke of being part of the American identity, it does go back to Europe, so much as these people were individualized enough to seek to escape the more unsavory aspects of what had been going on in Europe at that time, what had come to fruition in Europe at that time. And it speaks to this uniqueness of our character. And you see that ties into who we are as a nation and as a people. And it further expounds upon what we are seeking to accomplish. And that is really a quintessential part of who we are. Because without understanding this, it becomes very easy to try and redefine what our overarching goals are, what we were designed to accomplish, and what the government is about. And so we go back to this compact. It literally established a legal system from scratch. That was something that had not been done since the time of the provisions of Oxford, some 300 years before. And again, it was unique in so much as while it still had the king, it provided this buffer between the king and his colonial subjects. When you do that, it opens the gate to cleave away from that system if that system is no longer meeting or representing the needs of those people. That is what happened when our war for independence broke out, and therefore it's all connected. And so when we see these strains of populism, nationalism, progressivism, and Fabianism all trying to tear the societal fabric of these United States of America apart at its seams, it's that they are also trying to turn their backs on the foundational history of what would become the United States and the United States itself. And these are attributes that cannot be ignored. But the historical revisionists that infiltrate and infest our institutions of academia and higher learning from coast to coast and border to border are working tirelessly and meticulously to try and blot that out from the collective memory of the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty in this once thriving and flourishing representative republic of ours, we the people. It comes down to they don't want you to be able to tie these dots together. They don't want you to be able to connect the dots, because when you are able to do that, it means that this false drivel of a narrative that they are attempting to cram down our throats will fail each and every time, because it cannot compete in the free marketplace of ideas. They have to force it on you. Why? Because it's as Aristotle said in The Art of Rhetoric, that we are much more capable and willing and able to accept the truth than we are a lie. And of course, the entire premise of these systems is based on a lie. It's trying to redefine who we are as a nation and as a people. And every time that we do that, it further distances and divorces ourselves from the system of government that has worked so well for us. And there's something else to keep in mind. I know that I have oftentimes reiterated this on previous episodes of Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, but it is so on point that it bears repeating again here. And that is this, that when you distance and divorce yourself from the supreme law of the land, when you disregard who we are based on our history, then you are opening opening the floodgates for that to collapse. Of course, when you look at the Cloward and Piven principle, those two egghead academicians from Columbia University back in the 1950s and 60s, where they sought to overwhelm the welfare system so that the body politic would be knocked onto its knees and forced to crawl to the government to find a solution for the problems that government had created in the first place, to create a permanent subsistence welfare system. We see that they want the system to collapse. That's their end goal. Marxism, by its design, is always destructive. It's why in the Marxist dialectic that Karl Marx said that you cannot have the establishment of communism without a violent revolution which topples or overthrows the government, the pre-existing government. And that is one of the things and one of the attributes that the graduates of Pavlov School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media hasn't covered, and they don't want to cover it because, again, it strips power away from them. And we have to keep all of that in mind when we examine this, that the dots are there to be connected. The truth is there to be discovered. And the truth always has a way of shining through, which will ultimately set us free. And without that realization, we place ourselves in a precarious position. It means that we are susceptible to the dark and twisted machinations of those who want to fundamentally, drastically, and irreparably transform us away from being a constitutionally endowed, federalist, representative republic into something that we were never intended to be. And unless and until we come to terms with that, these problems will get worse. And that's just something we can ill afford right now, particularly with the current state of affairs that is ailing and afflicting us. The way that we have seen the Republican Party be transformed before our very eyes by the infiltration of these supposed alt-right, it again takes us away from that foundational spirit that started with the Mayflower Compact. So, as we approach Thanksgiving, I think we need to focus on some of that as we sit down and congregate with our friends, families, and loved ones to give thanks for the great and many bountiful gifts that we have had bestowed upon us throughout this year. Because in so doing, it helps us reaffirm what it is that we are hoping to achieve, both as a nation and as a people. Now, with that said, it is time for us to begin our descent. I'm going to go ahead and send the flight attendant back for one last round of alcohol. Folks, she doesn't care about progress. The only thing she wants to do is progress to pour you that last round. As always, folks, I'm your captain, Randy Wright, and I want to thank you for tuning in to our state-of-the-art radio program. Should you have any questions, comments, concerns, or even topic suggestions, please feel free to leave them in the comment section here at YouTube or on our Google Plus page or on our Facebook page, or you can contact us at Twitter with the Twitter handle at Radio Aviation EX. One more time, folks, that's at Radio Aviation EX. And there you will find the departure board that lists my personal Twitter account, as well as the personal Twitter account of my first officer, Jeremy Grapenton. You'll find a Blogspot account where we put extra links to the videos here, as well as audio-only versions of our state-of-the-art radio program, so that you can listen to them however you want or watch it however you want at your leisure. And you will also find the Cafe Press account. And at the Cafe Press account, we have all sorts of trinkets and goodies that make perfect holiday gifts and stocking stuffers with either our original Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer logo on it, or our First Class Passenger logo on it, or the two new Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, Uplifting America logos. And this is on hats, shoes, attire, apparel, mugs, drinking glasses, shot glasses, hats, laptop bags, sleeves and protectors, tote bags, phone protectors, buttons, jewelry, neckties, you name it. It's there at reasonable prices. So go ahead and start your shopping early this season, folks. Show them that you are a popular sovereign. Now, we'll see you again next time. Please do take care.